The first time my brother-in-law laughed at me, I almost let it pass. Not because it did not hurt, but because I had learned a long time ago that not every insult deserves a battlefield. Some people reveal themselves quietly, with one careless sentence, one smirk, one glance that says they have already decided who you are before you ever open your mouth. That evening, I was standing in the warm yellow light of my sister's dining room in Fairfax, Virginia, wearing a navy blue blouse instead of a uniform, soft makeup instead of dust and sweat, and a calm face instead of the one I used to wear when things went wrong overseas. To everyone else, I looked like an ordinary woman arriving late to a family dinner. To Mark, my sister's husband, I looked like an easy target. I had almost turned the car around before walking in. I remember sitting outside the house with the engine still running, staring at the neat front lawn, the trimmed hedges, the American flag moving gently on the porch. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other, where children left bikes in driveways, where dinner smelled like garlic, roast chicken, and cinnamon pie cooling somewhere in the kitchen. Normal. That word had always felt strange to me, like a coat I could wear for a while but never truly owned. I checked my reflection in the mirror one last time, hair tied back, eyes steady, no rank, no medals, no hint of the life I had once lived. Just a woman named Evelyn Reed, trying to sit through dinner without becoming a story. My sister Claire opened the door before I could knock twice. "Eve, you made it," she said, and hugged me with both arms. I stiffened for half a second before hugging her back. I was still relearning small things like that. How long to hold on, how not to scan the room before stepping inside, how to smile before assessing exits. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, though we both knew that was not completely true. She pulled me through the hallway, introducing me to cousins, neighbors, old family friends, and relatives connected by marriage more than memory. Their names came quickly and disappeared just as fast. I nodded, smiled, shook hands, and answered the usual questions. "Where are you living now? Are you still with the Navy? Do you miss it?" I gave the safe answers, the kind that keep dinner moving. Then I saw Mark leaning against the entrance to the dining room, one hand in his pocket, a glass of wine in the other. He had the relaxed confidence of a man who had never been truly tested but had spent years convincing others he had. Expensive watch, sharp shirt, perfect smile. Claire introduced us like she was proud to bring two parts of her life together. "Mark, this is my sister, Evelyn." He looked me up and down, not openly rude, but measuring me. "So you're the Navy sister," he said. "I've heard about you." "Some of it might even be true," I replied. He chuckled, but not warmly. "Special operations, right? Or is that just what everyone says when the job was boring?" A few people nearby laughed because they thought he was joking. I did not. I had heard that tone before, from men who needed to make someone smaller so they could feel taller. "Various assignments," I said. "That's all." He lifted his eyebrows. "Sounds mysterious." I gave him nothing. Silence bothers people who are used to filling rooms with themselves. Mark just smirked and turned away, already deciding I was either exaggerating or hiding behind a title I had not earned. Dinner began at 6:30. Claire had set the table carefully. White plates, folded napkins, candles, wine glasses, everything arranged like she wanted the evening to feel important. I sat near the middle, not too visible, not too hidden. Across from me sat an older man I did not know yet. Late 70s, maybe early 80s, straight-backed, steady-handed, with clear gray eyes that missed very little. Claire introduced him as Uncle Frank, Mark's great-uncle, a Vietnam veteran who rarely came to family gatherings anymore. He gave me a polite nod and said nothing else at first. But he watched, not with suspicion, with recognition of habits most people never notice. The way I sat facing the room, the way I set my glass down without sound, the way I listened before speaking. Conversation started light. Traffic. The upcoming wedding of Mark's cousin. Real estate prices. A story about Claire burning a Thanksgiving turkey 3 years earlier. People laughed, passed dishes, poured wine. I let the warmth of the room settle around me and almost believed the night might stay simple. Then, as it always does, the conversation moved from general to personal. A cousin near the end of the table leaned forward and asked, "Evelyn, what exactly did you do in the Navy?" I took a sip of water. Special operations, I said. That usually ended the conversation, not because people understood, but because most people knew when not to push. Mark did not. Special operations? He repeated, dragging the words out like he was testing them for cracks. What does that mean exactly? It means I worked on assignments that are not dinner table stories, I said. A few people smiled. Mark leaned forward. Classified? Some of it. Convenient. Claire shot him a look. Mark. He raised both hands as if innocent. What? I'm just curious. You can't blame me. Someone says special operations. I want to know whether we're talking real action or paperwork with better branding. The table grew a little quieter. I felt Frank's eyes on me, still calm, still waiting. I set my fork down gently. You can think whatever you like, I said. I usually do, Mark replied, and laughed at his own line. That was when he asked the question. Not loudly, not even aggressively, but with the careless arrogance of someone poking at a locked door because he does not believe anything dangerous is behind it. So, he said, if you were such a Navy legend, what was your nickname? The room did not go silent right away. There was a small opening there, a chance for me to smile, deflect, make a joke, let him win his little moment. I could have said nothing. I should have said nothing, but something in his face told me he would keep pushing until someone stopped him, and I was too tired to dance around a man who mistook patience for weakness. I looked at him across the table. Mad Dog, I said. A couple of people laughed softly, uncertainly, because they thought it sounded absurd, the kind of nickname invented in a movie. Mark laughed too, louder than the rest. Mad Dog? Seriously? He said. Come on, Eve. That's a little dramatic. But across from me, Uncle Frank had stopped moving. His glass was halfway to his lips, frozen in the air. His eyes locked on mine, and everything about his face changed. Not surprise, not amusement. Recognition. The kind that reaches a man from decades away and pulls him back into places he never fully left. Then Frank lowered his glass and said, Apologize. Now. The word was not loud, but it cut through the room so cleanly that even the candle flames seemed to still. Mark blinked. Excuse me? Frank did not raise his voice. You heard me. Claire looked from him to Mark, then to me. What happened? No one answered. Mark gave a short, dismissive chuckle. Uncle Frank, come on. It's just a nickname. Frank's face hardened. No, he said. It is not. The table went completely quiet. Fork stopped. Someone's hand hovered over the bread basket and then withdrew. The roast chicken sat untouched under the soft dining room light. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its headlights sliding across the curtains like a warning. Mark looked around, expecting support, but none came. For the first time that evening, his confidence faltered. Am I missing something? He asked. Frank kept his eyes on him. Yes, he said. You are. I folded my hands in my lap, calm on the outside, though something old had begun moving inside me. Claire whispered my name, but I did not look away from Frank. He knew. I did not know how much, but he knew enough. And that was the moment I understood the dinner was already over. Not the meal. Not the evening. Something quieter than that. The comfortable lie that everyone at that table knew who I was. Mark leaned back and tried one more laugh, thinner this time. This is ridiculous. I asked a question. Frank's answer came low and steady. No. You issued a challenge to a woman you know nothing about. His words landed harder than any shout could have. Then he turned to me, and the weight in his eyes made the room feel smaller. Did I hear you right? He asked. I nodded once. You did. Frank exhaled slowly, like a man hearing a name he had hoped never to hear at a family table. Mark stared between us, his smile gone now. What the hell is Mad Dog supposed to mean? He asked. Frank did not answer immediately. Neither did I. Because some names are not stories. Some names are receipts. Proof of what something cost. Nobody reached for their food after that. The dining room remained frozen in a silence so complete that even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than before. The roast chicken sat untouched. Steam no longer rose from the mashed potatoes. Somewhere in the kitchen, an oven timer began beeping insistently before Claire hurried away to silence it. Even that ordinary sound felt strange. Mark looked from Uncle Frank to me, and back again. "What is this?" he asked with a nervous laugh. "Seriously, did I walk into some kind of military fan club?" Frank didn't react. He simply folded his napkin once and placed it beside his plate. "No," he said quietly. "You walked into a lesson." The room became even quieter. Mark's smile faded another degree. "Okay," he said. "Now you're making this weird." "No," Frank replied. "You made it weird when you decided a stranger needed to prove herself for your entertainment." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Claire returned from the kitchen and sat down slowly. "Can somebody tell me what's happening?" Nobody answered immediately. Because nobody really knew. Not completely. They only knew that a simple nickname had somehow transformed a family dinner into something else. Something heavier. Something real. I sat quietly, letting the moment unfold. Years ago, I might have intervened. I might have diffused the situation. I might have protected everyone from the discomfort. But I had spent too many years carrying burdens that weren't mine. Tonight wasn't one of them. Mark looked at me. "You could clear this up pretty quickly." "How?" "Tell everybody why this matters." I met his eyes. "I don't need it to matter." That answer frustrated him. "You know exactly what I mean." "Yes," I said. "Then answer." I took a slow sip of water. "No." The word landed harder than I intended. Not because it was loud, because it was calm. Across the table, Uncle Frank nodded almost imperceptibly. For the first time all evening, somebody understood what Mark did not. Some stories aren't hidden because they're impressive. They're hidden because they hurt. Frank finally leaned forward. "I served in Vietnam." Nobody interrupted him. His voice carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. "After I got home, I spent decades around veterans, organizations, military charities, and federal contractors." Mark crossed his arms. So every once in a while," Frank continued, "a name would come up." He looked directly at me. "Not often." My shoulders tightened slightly. "Not publicly." The room waited. "Not in newspapers." Mark frowned. "Then where?" Frank ignored him. But whenever it came up, people got quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a glass. The room was hanging on every word. Mark shook his head. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" "Yes." Frank's eyes hardened. "You think military people invent stories because they're bored?" "No." "Then stop acting like it." Mark looked away. For the first time since dinner started, he had no quick response. Claire turned toward me. "Evelyn." Her voice was soft now, almost cautious. "Is any of this true?" I gave her the only answer I was willing to give. "Some of it." That made things worse. Mark immediately jumped on it. "Some of it?" "There," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." He pointed toward me. "Some of it means what?" I remained calm. "It means exactly what I said." "That doesn't answer anything." "It answers enough." Mark laughed again, but this time nobody joined him. Not one person. That was when he realized he was standing alone. The realization showed in his face. Only slightly. But enough. Uncle Frank watched him carefully. "You're still treating this like a game." "No." "Yes." Frank's voice remained steady. "You think she's trying to impress people?" Mark shrugged. "What am I supposed to think?" I finally spoke. "You could start by thinking less about being impressed." He looked at me. "And more about what?" "Respect." The word sat between us. Heavy. Unavoidable. "You don't owe me admiration." I kept my voice level. "You don't owe me praise." The room listened. "But you owe people basic respect before deciding they're lying." Nobody said anything. Not Claire. Not Aunt Louise. Not the cousins. Nobody. Because everyone knew that sentence wasn't really about military service. It was about character. And Mark knew it too. His jaw tightened. Frank nodded once. "Exactly." The old veteran leaned back. Then he said something that changed the room. "Most people think nicknames like that are trophies." He looked around the table. "They aren't." Nobody moved. "They are invoices." The room fell completely silent. Mark frowned. "What does that even mean?" Frank's gaze drifted toward me. "It means somebody paid for them." A chill moved through the room. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smiled. For the first time, everyone understood they had been standing near something they couldn't quite see. And suddenly they wanted to. Not because it was exciting. Because it felt important. Claire swallowed. What exactly did you hear? Frank was quiet for several seconds. Long enough that everyone leaned forward slightly. Then he answered, "Years ago there was talk." "Talk about what?" "A rescue operation." I immediately looked down at my glass. Frank noticed. So did Mark. The room became still. "A bad one," Frank continued. "The kind where things go wrong." Mark's confidence had almost completely vanished now. "What kind of rescue?" Frank shook his head. "I don't know every detail." That was true. But I know enough. His eyes settled on me. There were Americans trapped. Nobody spoke. There were casualties. Claire's face paled. And there was somebody who refused to leave people behind. Mark stared at me. His expression was different now. Not mocking. Not dismissive. Trying to understand. Trying and failing. "That was her?" Frank didn't answer. Neither did I. The silence answered for us. Mark sat back slowly. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. A younger cousin named Caleb finally spoke. "You mean like a hostage rescue?" "Something like that," Frank said. "What happened?" Frank shook his head. "That's not my story to tell." Everybody looked at me. Every single person. I hated that feeling. Not because they were judging me anymore. Because they weren't. Now they were doing something worse. They were turning me into a story. And stories stop being human once people tell them often enough. Claire noticed the discomfort immediately. "You don't have to talk about it." "Thank you." Mark looked down at his plate. Then back at me. Then down again. The arrogance was gone now. Replaced by something far less comfortable. Embarrassment. But he wasn't ready to surrender completely. Not yet. "So there's no proof." The words came out weaker than before. I looked directly at him. "You still think this is about status?" He didn't answer. "That's why you're confused." The room went silent again. I continued. "You think this is about proving who's important." Mark opened his mouth. Closed it. "You think this is about medals." Still nothing. "It isn't." The sentence hit him harder than anything else had. Because deep down he knew I was right. Uncle Frank folded his hands. "Son," he said quietly, "you keep asking the wrong question." Mark looked at him. "Then what's the right question?" Frank's eyes moved toward me. The old veteran's face darkened slightly, as though an old memory had returned. "The right question," he said slowly, "is what happened during that mission that made experienced men stop talking whenever her name came up." The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody looked away. And for the first time all evening, Mark wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to understand. He looked directly at me. His voice barely above a whisper. "What happened out there?" I didn't answer Mark immediately. Some questions sound simple when they're asked across a dinner table. But they aren't. They reach into places most people spend years trying to keep organized. Not hidden. Just organized. The difference matters. I looked down at my hands resting quietly on the table. The room waited. Nobody interrupted. Even Mark seemed to understand that whatever came next wasn't entertainment anymore. It wasn't a story people would repeat over coffee. It wasn't something dramatic meant to impress strangers. It was something heavier. Something real. Finally, I took a slow breath. "It wasn't one moment," I said. Mark frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I looked at him. People always want one moment. The room remained silent. They want one decision. I glanced toward Uncle Frank. One heroic action. Frank nodded faintly. "But that's not how things happen." Nobody moved. I continued. "The mission started like hundreds of others." The words came easier now. Not because they were comfortable. Because there was no point avoiding them anymore. We received intelligence about several American contractors being held in a remote compound. Claire's eyes widened slightly. I kept going. The information looked solid. It usually does. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared. Not because it was funny. Because everyone understood the meaning. Bad information rarely announces itself. It was supposed to be simple. Caleb leaned forward. "A rescue mission?" "Yes. Quick in, quick out." I paused. At least that was the plan. The room grew quiet again. Outside, darkness pressed gently against the windows. Inside, nobody touched their food anymore. When we arrived, something felt wrong. Mark listened carefully now. No interruptions. No challenges. Just attention. The layout didn't match the briefing. I said. The number of armed personnel didn't match the briefing. I looked toward my untouched plate. The equipment didn't match the briefing. Caleb swallowed. So somebody messed up. I shook my head slowly. Maybe. The answer surprised him. Maybe? I nodded. Sometimes people make mistakes. The room listened. And sometimes people lie. That sentence landed heavily. Nobody asked which one it had been. Not yet. We entered anyway. My voice remained calm. Because that's what training does. It teaches you how to talk about chaos without sounding chaotic. Within 90 seconds, we knew we had a problem. Claire's hand moved toward her mouth. What happened? I stared at a point beyond the dining room wall. A place nobody else could see. We took fire from positions that shouldn't have existed. The room became motionless. There were more hostiles than expected. I paused. Far more. Nobody spoke. The mission changed immediately. Mark shifted in his seat. You mean it became dangerous? I almost smiled. Dangerous. People always use that word. As though danger begins at some specific point. As though there is a line. A moment. A switch. No. I looked at him. It became impossible. Silence. Complete silence. Uncle Frank lowered his eyes briefly. Because he understood. Veterans understand the difference. Dangerous means difficult. Impossible means people die. We pushed forward anyway. I continued. Because there were civilians inside. The room listened carefully. There are moments when you can still turn around. I said, and there are moments when turning around becomes its own decision. Nobody interrupted. Nobody even looked away. We reached the first building. I continued. The hostages weren't there. Caleb frowned. What? The intelligence was wrong. The words sounded simple, almost harmless, but everyone at the table could feel the weight behind them. The compound was larger. Much larger. We had entered the wrong section. Mark rubbed his forehead. So the entire plan was useless. Pretty much. Claire looked pale now. What happened then? I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I needed to remember. Because remembering had never stopped. We split into teams. I said, trying to locate the civilians. The room waited. We found them. Relief appeared briefly on a few faces. Then, vanished. Because they could hear something unfinished in my voice. But? Mark asked. I looked at him. But by then we had already lost people. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed loudly. I continued before anyone could respond. The first casualty happened 6 minutes after insertion. Claire lowered her eyes. Caleb stared at the table. Mark swallowed. I kept talking. Not because I wanted to. Because stopping there would have been worse. The second happened less than 3 minutes later. Nobody reacted. The silence itself became the reaction. There were injuries. There was confusion. There was smoke. There were communications failures. My voice remained steady. Only years of practice made that possible. Inside, the memories still felt sharp. We eventually received the order to withdraw. That got everyone's attention. Mark leaned forward. You had the hostages? No. The answer stunned him. His eyes widened. No? I shook my head. We located them. I said, but we couldn't reach them. The room became very still. The situation had collapsed. Uncle Frank closed his eyes briefly. He already knew where this story was heading. Veterans always do. The language changes. The rhythm changes. The feeling changes. You learn to recognize it. We were ordered to leave. I said quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. We were told to regroup. Mark stared at me. And you did? I looked directly at him. At first, the answer hung there. Heavy. Dangerous. Final, Claire whispered. What do you mean, at first? I leaned back slightly. Because now we were reaching the part people always focus on. The wrong part. The part that eventually becomes headlines. Stories. Legends. Nicknames. The part people remember. Not the fear. Not the losses. Not the cost. Just the decision. We pulled back. I said. We reached the extraction point. The room remained silent. The helicopters arrived. Caleb looked confused. Then the mission was over. No. My voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't. Everybody watched me. Every single person. The hostages were still there. Nobody spoke. The people we came for were still trapped. The room somehow became quieter. I remember sitting there. I continued, listening to engines, listening to radios, listening to people talk about regrouping. I stared at the table, but all I could think about was what would happen to the civilians after we left. Claire's eyes glistened slightly. Mark remained frozen. For the first time all evening, he wasn't judging. He wasn't analyzing. He wasn't arguing. He was simply listening. I took a slow breath. The truth? Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The truth is, I couldn't live with it. Silence. Heavy. Absolute. I knew what the orders were. I continued. I understood the chain of command. I understood the consequences. Mark whispered. But? I looked directly into his eyes. The room seemed to shrink. The walls, the lights, the voices, everything disappeared, leaving only the memory. And then I realized something. Nobody moved. What? Mark asked quietly. I held his gaze, the same way I had years ago while staring into darkness beyond that compound. If we left, my voice dropped lower. Those people would die. Nobody breathed. Nobody blinked. Nobody spoke. The room felt suspended in time. And that's when I made the decision. Claire looked terrified now. Uncle Frank already knew. I could see it in his eyes. He knew exactly what was coming next. Mark swallowed hard. What decision? I stared at him for several seconds, then finally answered. I went back. The room froze. Completely. You what? Caleb whispered. I went back. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody understood. Not yet. Mark stared at me, his face pale now. With your team? I slowly shook my head. The silence that followed felt endless. Then I answered. No. The room stopped breathing. I went back alone. Nobody spoke. For several long seconds, the entire dining room remained completely still. The kind of silence that happens when people hear something they weren't prepared to hear. Mark stared at me. His face had gone pale. You went back alone? I nodded once. Yes. Claire looked like she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Alone? At first, that answer confused everyone. Even Uncle Frank leaned forward slightly. I took a breath. Not because the memory was painful, because it was complicated. People like simple versions of difficult events. Life rarely provides them. I wasn't supposed to go back. I continued. There wasn't some dramatic speech. There wasn't some heroic declaration. The room listened. I simply couldn't get on that helicopter. Mark shook his head slowly. Why? I looked at him. Because he still wanted logic. Still wanted a clean explanation. The same reason most people run into a burning house. I said, they aren't thinking about bravery. They're thinking about who's still inside. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The civilians were still there. I continued. And every minute we waited reduced their chances. Claire's eyes remained fixed on me. What did you do? I turned around. The words sounded simple, but they changed the entire room. I left the extraction zone, I said, and headed back. Caleb started. By yourself? For a while, I answered. The room waited. The truth is, one of my teammates saw what I was doing. A small smile crossed my face. Then another. And another. Uncle Frank nodded, as if he had expected exactly that. Nobody wanted to leave them, I said. Not really. The room remained silent. So eventually there were 4 of us. Mark exhaled slowly. You disobeyed orders. Yes. All of you? Yes. Nobody seemed to know what to do with that information, because now the story wasn't about a single reckless decision. It was about 4 people who independently reached the same conclusion. The hostages mattered more. The compound had gone quiet by then. I continued. That's what scared me most. Caleb frowned. Why? Because gunfire is information. The room listened. Silence isn't. Nobody spoke. We moved through the outer buildings. I continued. Slowly. Carefully. We knew they would be expecting us. Mark was completely focused now. Not a trace of arrogance remained. Only attention. Only respect. We located the civilians in a storage structure near the rear of the compound. I said. There were 13 of them. Claire whispered. Oh my God. Some were injured. I continued. Most were terrified. They had already heard the first assault. The room listened. They thought nobody was coming back. Nobody moved. I looked down briefly. Then continued. To be honest, the room waited. So did I. Silence. Heavy. Real. How did you get them out? Mark asked quietly. I leaned back slightly. We almost didn't. Nobody blinked. The second assault was worse than the first. The room became still again. There were fewer of us. Less ammunition. Less support. And no surprise. Nobody spoke. The old clock ticked softly on the wall. Every person at the table seemed frozen in place. We started moving the civilians. I continued. But halfway to the extraction route we were discovered. Claire covered her mouth. Mark looked down. Then back up. Nobody wanted to interrupt anymore. The story had become too real. What happened? Caleb asked softly. I stared into my water glass. The reflection trembled slightly. Everything happened. I said. There was gunfire. There was confusion. There were injuries. There was screaming. The room listened. And there was a moment when I genuinely believed none of us were getting out. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away. I continued. One of the civilians was a young contractor. He couldn't have been more than 23. The room remained silent. He froze. I said. Completely. I remember grabbing him, dragging him, yelling at him. A faint smile appeared. He later told me he thought I was insane. That earned the smallest laugh of the evening. A nervous laugh. A human one. I probably looked insane. I admitted. But we kept moving. Mark shook his head. You saved all 13? I looked at him. No. The answer hit hard. Very hard. Nobody expected it. Claire lowered her eyes. Uncle Frank remained motionless. I continued quietly. 12. Silence. Absolute silence. The room seemed smaller now. More intimate. More painful. One didn't make it. Nobody knew what to say. Because there is nothing to say. Not really. After several seconds, Frank finally spoke. That's the part people never understand. I nodded. Exactly. The room listened. They hear rescue. I continued. They hear success. They hear medals. I looked around the table. What they don't hear is the name of the person who didn't come home. Nobody moved. Mark looked devastated. Not for himself. For the first time all evening. For somebody else, the mission succeeded. I continued. The civilians were recovered. The survivors were evacuated. The reports were written. The investigations happened. The paperwork was completed. I paused. But one family still buried their son. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Inside, the dining room felt miles away from Virginia. Miles away from dinner. Miles away from normal life. Mark swallowed hard. So that's where the nickname came from. I looked at him. Partly? The room listened. I continued. One of the rescued civilians gave an interview months later. They asked how he survived. I smiled faintly. He said there was this crazy Navy woman who refused to leave. A few people smiled. He said she kept coming forward no matter what happened. I looked down briefly. Someone jokingly called me Mad Dog. The smile disappeared. Then it stuck. Nobody laughed. Because now they understood. The nickname wasn't cool. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't glamorous. It was attached to one of the worst nights of my life. Frank nodded slowly. That's what I thought. The old veteran looked at me with something deeper than admiration. Understanding. The rarest form of respect. Mark stared at the table for several moments, then finally looked up. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. I'm sorry. Nobody moved. He continued. No jokes. No excuses. No explanations. He met my eyes. I'm genuinely sorry. The room waited. I studied him. The man sitting across from me wasn't the same man who had started dinner. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. In its place was something better. Humility. I nodded once. Thank you. The tension in the room eased slightly. Not completely. But enough. Claire exhaled as though she'd been holding her breath for an hour. Aunt Louise wiped at her eyes. Caleb stared down at his plate. Frank leaned back slowly. The worst of the evening had passed. But I wasn't finished. Because there was one thing nobody at that table understood yet. Not even Mark. Not even Claire. Not even Frank. People always assume survival is the happy ending. It isn't. Survival is where the difficult part begins. I looked around the table, then quietly said the words that made everyone pause again. The hardest part wasn't surviving that night. The room froze. Mark frowned. What was? I looked at him, my voice barely above a whisper. The hardest part, I said, was learning how to live afterward. Nobody spoke after that. The words seemed to settle over the table and remain there. The hardest part wasn't surviving. The hardest part was learning how to live afterward. For several seconds, the only sound in the room came from the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Mark looked at me. I don't understand. I gave a small smile. I know. The room listened. Because this was the part people rarely asked about. The part that never appears in movies. The part nobody puts in speeches. Everybody loves the rescue. Very few people care about what comes after. I folded my hands together. When I came home, everyone expected me to be grateful. Nobody moved. And I was. I continued. I was grateful to be alive. Grateful to see my family. Grateful to sleep in my own bed. I paused. But gratitude doesn't fix everything. Claire's eyes softened. I could tell she was beginning to understand. At least a little. You wake up differently. I said. You think differently. You react differently. Mark remained completely focused. No interruptions. No challenges. Just listening. For a long time, every crowded room felt wrong. I admitted. Every unexpected noise. Every slammed door. Every ringing phone. The room was silent. I would automatically look for exits. I said. I would memorize faces. I would assess threats without realizing it. A faint smile crossed Frank's face. He understood. Veterans always do. I thought that would go away. I continued. It didn't. Nobody spoke. Not completely. The room felt smaller now. Not uncomfortable. Intimate. Honest. Claire finally asked. Did you ever talk to anyone? I smiled. The Navy made sure I did. That earned a few soft laughs. The first genuine laughs of the evening. I met therapists. I said. I met counselors. I met other veterans. They helped. I paused. But healing isn't something another person can do for you. Mark nodded slowly. It takes time. Yes. I looked at him. A lot of time. Nobody moved. I continued. The strange part wasn't the nightmares. The strange part wasn't the memories. The room listened carefully. It was realizing the world kept moving. That sentence landed differently. Everyone felt it. Because everyone over 40 understands that feeling. You suffer. You struggle. You lose. And meanwhile, life keeps going. The sun rises. People go to work. Children grow up. Neighbors mow their lawns. The world never pauses. Not even for grief. Not even for trauma. Not even for heroes. Frank lowered his eyes. I could tell he knew exactly what I meant. Some mornings I would wake up. I continued. And feel guilty for being alive. Nobody spoke. Claire looked devastated. Mark looked down at the table. I kept going. Because the truth deserves to be told completely. That young contractor. I said quietly. The one who didn't make it. The room grew still. I thought about him constantly. Nobody interrupted. I kept replaying decisions. What if I moved faster? What if I turned left instead of right? What if I reached him sooner? The room listened. What if? I smiled sadly. Veterans become experts at those two words. Frank nodded. A slow, painful nod. Because he understood. Everybody at the table could see it now. The nickname. The rescue. The mission. Those weren't the things I carried. The things I carried were invisible. And much heavier. Mark finally spoke. How did you get through it? I thought about that question carefully. Because there wasn't one answer. There never is. People. I finally said. The room waited. Good people. Claire smiled slightly. I continued. My teammates. My family. Other veterans. Strangers who showed kindness when they didn't have to. I looked toward Mark. Even people who made mistakes. His face reddened slightly. But he smiled. A real smile this time. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Human. I definitely made one tonight. A few people chuckled softly. You did. I agreed. That earned another small laugh. The atmosphere became lighter. Not because the subject changed. Because honesty had removed the tension. Mark looked at me for several moments. Then asked something unexpected. Do you regret going back? The room froze again. Everybody wanted the answer. Even Frank. I thought about it. Long enough that nobody interrupted. Finally, I shook my head. No, the answer came without hesitation. Not because it worked. I clarified. The room listened. But because I couldn't have lived with myself if I hadn't tried. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The answer explained everything. Frank smiled. The old veteran looked more relaxed now than at any point during the evening. That's what I hoped you'd say. I looked at him. You already knew. He nodded. Yes. Then he added quietly, people like you always give the same answer. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. The kind of silence earned by truth. Eventually Claire stood and began clearing plates. Dessert appeared. Coffee was poured. Conversations slowly resumed. But everything felt different now. More genuine. More honest. More human. Mark passed dishes without being asked. Caleb asked Frank about Vietnam. Aunt Louise told stories about relatives nobody remembered. And for the first time all evening, I stopped feeling like an outsider. Hours later, after dessert, I stepped outside onto the front porch. The night air was cool. The neighborhood was quiet. A few porch lights glowed in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked. Otherwise, silence. The front door opened behind me. I already knew who it was. Frank stepped outside. He stood beside me without speaking. For a while, we simply looked at the street. Then he said quietly, "You handled tonight well." I smiled. I wasn't trying to. I know. We stood there a little longer. Then he said something I never forgot. Most people don't need to understand everything you've been through. I looked at him. They just need to respect it. I nodded slowly. That's enough. Yes. He smiled. It is. The next morning arrived peacefully. Sunlight filled the kitchen. Coffee brewed. People moved around the house. Normal life. Exactly the kind of thing I had spent years trying to appreciate. At breakfast, Mark approached me before anyone else arrived. He looked uncomfortable. Not ashamed. Thoughtful. I talked to Frank. I smiled. I'm sure you did. Mark laughed softly. He told me I was lucky. I raised an eyebrow. Lucky? He nodded. He said I learned an important lesson at a dinner table. I smiled. Sounds like Frank. Mark looked down briefly. Then back up. I judge people too quickly. The admission surprised nobody. Not even him. I think most people do. I said, yeah. He nodded. But I don't want to anymore. That was enough. Not perfection. Not redemption. Just willingness. Sometimes that's all growth really is. By late morning, it was time to leave. Claire hugged me tightly. You better come back for the wedding. I will. She smiled. Mark stepped forward next. This time there was no awkwardness. No competition. No assumptions. He extended his hand. I shook it. Thank you. He said. For what? For not giving up on me after I acted like an idiot. I laughed softly. You're welcome. Frank walked me to the front door. As I stepped outside, he stopped me. You know. I turned. What? He smiled. You changed more lives than you realize. I shook my head. I just told the truth. Frank's smile widened. That's usually enough. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. The same seat. The same steering wheel. The same driveway. Yet everything felt different. Not because people suddenly knew my story. Because they finally stopped assuming they already did. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Claire and Mark stood together near the front door. Frank stood behind them. 3 generations. 3 different lives. 3 people who had entered dinner believing one thing and left believing another. I don't think about the nickname much anymore. Mad Dog was never something I carried with pride. It was never a trophy. It was never a badge. It was simply a reminder. A reminder of what courage costs. A reminder of people who never came home. A reminder that respect matters more than recognition. And that night taught me something too. Not everybody who misjudges you is cruel. Sometimes they're simply uninformed. Sometimes they're immature. Sometimes they're carrying blind spots they haven't discovered yet. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, they learn. People don't need to know every chapter of your story. They don't need to understand every scar. They don't need to agree with every choice. But they should respect the fact that battles they never saw may have shaped the person standing in front of them. And if they do that, sometimes strangers become friends. Sometimes families become stronger. And sometimes one ordinary dinner becomes something nobody ever forgets.